With Counter-Strike 2 being released almost a year ago now, fans have been enjoying much more modernized graphics and some new mechanics added to their CS experience. And as of January 2024, the previous Counter-Strike Global Offensive has officially had its support ended, leaving CSGO to fade into the background into pretty much an unplayable state. But fans haven't forgotten the memories they've had with CSGO over those many years. While we previously took a look at 2003's Counter-Strike Xbox version, I thought we should continue this trend, taking a look at the only other CS console released to this day, and probably the only one we'll ever see going forward. So let's take a look into CSGO's original console versions, how they were developed, and why they never even ended up getting so much as a single update. The origins of Global Offensive itself are actually quite interesting, starting out of something completely different. Hidden Path Entertainment was a support studio that had worked with Valve on Counter-Strike Source in 2010, namely a large update to bring the game from Source Engine's 2006 build over to the updated 2009 build. Around this time, Hidden Path would also have an ongoing project to fully port Counter-Strike Source over to the Xbox 360. Valve was intrigued by the idea and the work that had been done by Hidden Path on the port, so they decided to turn it into its own independent CS game instead. So it would probably surprise many to hear that the console version for CSGO was actually the original version of CSGO. Hidden Path's CEO noted this when he was asked about CSGO prior to its release, stating that the game mainly grew out of their Xbox 360 port of CSS at the time. Since the release of the Orange Box, Gabe Newell had a widely known distaste for console development, namely Sony's PlayStation platform, which is understandable given its reputation. Nonetheless, in 2009, development of Counter-Strike Global Offensive would begin, primarily with Hidden Path working on the game. Valve would become more involved with its development later on in 2010, when it was decided that the game would become its own unique title aside from a CSS port. The original look of these early development versions was pretty similar to Counter-Strike Source overall, using many of its assets at the time, and much of the new content being developed seemed to take on a similar design. I won't look too deeply into the early beta content here, but if that's something you'd like to see in a video in the future, let me know in the comments. CSGO was first revealed at PAX 2011 with a demo on the Xbox 360. Valve even stated the game would provide a sort of crossplay option, so players on PC, Xbox, and PlayStation could all play together. Obviously, this idea was changed rather quickly. I mean, it was a very ambitious idea for the time, considering how crossplay really didn't exist yet, but let's be honest, that would have been a pretty horrible experience for console players. In November of the same year, CSGO would have its closed beta test for a smaller group of players, and would have its projected release date of August 21st announced at E3 2012, with an open beta available a month before. Upon its release, CSGO in general was a bit polarizing to say the least. While it received generally positive reviews from critics, it was a different story for the much more important base of people, the players. The general community and professional players alike were coming over from previous versions of CS, and most of them really did not like the new feeling of CSGO back then. For that reason, most of them just chose to stick to either 1.6 or Source for the time being, so CSGO's player base for the first year or so of its launch was still there, but somewhat underwhelming. The game still sold well enough at its launch though, after all, it is a Counter-Strike game, and as it saw consistent updates, the introduction of operations, and especially the skin market, its popularity grew quite a bit from around 2014 to 2015, as players really started to shift over from older versions of CS, as well as a whole new generation of players being introduced to the franchise itself. But that's just the story for CSGO on PC, as most of us know it. The console versions, on the other hand, were a pretty different story. Global Offensive would release on August 21st, 2012, the same day for all platforms. The PC and Xbox 360 saw both physical and digital releases, but oddly enough the PS3 didn't for some reason, only offering it on the PlayStation Store. For this video I'll be playing the PS3 version, as it's virtually the exact same as the 360 release. Now, it wouldn't be exactly fair to compare the 2012 console version to the final 2023 PC version of CSGO, as the entire game has changed, so for any comparisons, I'll just be using versions that are somewhat closer to one another. And to avoid turning my PC into ground zero for some malware botnet, I decided to skip over the various community uploaded archives of CSGO's older versions, and just go for the oldest official depot I could find. The obvious first thing to note here is the menus. Both the PC and console versions use the old Scaleform UI, which was later replaced by Panorama in 2018. It's not a bad UI, I actually prefer it to Panorama personally, and it still functions, kind of. But it definitely reeks of 2011 and 2012 gaming, that's for sure. A cool thing to note about the old PC version though is that the player stats and leaderboards actually still work, and from what I can tell, they still do update with your current CS2 gameplay stats. Jesus Christ, I played a lot of Inferno. For content on launch, all platforms pretty much got the same offerings, the classic hostage and defuse modes as well as war games like Arms Race and Demolition. The maps were the typical CS selection, most of which were remakes from the older versions with a few new maps thrown in. So I hopped into some good old classic modes and war games against bots and it was playable. Not necessarily enjoyable, but as I've said before, it's Counter-Strike on a console. Now I started playing Global Offensive back in 2013, and suffice to say it's changed considerably over the years, but CSGO in 2012 was an entirely different experience. If you didn't play it in its early years, let's just try and sum it up here. The game felt slow and clunky, while also feeling too much, floaty? It's kind of like walking in a vat of oil while covered in glue. It definitely felt like they were trying their best to give a balance between the movement of the original CS and Source to get the best of both worlds, but in the end it kind of just turned out feeling worse than either of them. Luckily though, the general issues and concerns with movements and all that were tweaked and improved pretty quickly. Well, at least for the PC version, as once again, neither the Xbox nor the PlayStation versions were ever updated, not even once. As for the feeling of the general controls, well, if you watched my video about Counter-Strike's Xbox edition from 2003, I tried to explain the feeling of playing CS with a controller. I'll just say my point still stands here. It works well enough, but it generally doesn't feel good at all. At the very least, CSX had some sort of aim assist to help with that. CSGO's console version, however, for some reason did not, making the experience even against the easy bots feel, well, downright irritating to play with. Both the console versions were locked to 30 FPS at a maximum rendering resolution of 720p. It may sound a bit low now, but that was pretty much par of the course when it came to the 7th generation of consoles, and it really isn't too bothersome. Both the console versions look pretty much the same as one another, the only exception in their design being that the Xbox used D3D for rendering, whereas the PS3 used OpenGL. But there's really no graphical or performance disparity between the two. They both looked mostly the same and, well, ran the same, which is the main issue with these versions. The FPS stability was, well, They both often struggled to stay at their 30 FPS target, a problem only made worse by the decision to use forced motion blur, but once again, not an uncommon technique for console titles of the time. Aside from that, CSGO's console version looked pretty comparable to its PC counterpart, I guess. But going back to the PlayStation 3 for the first time in a couple years really made me remember the most noticeable graphical difference in the 7th generation console games, that being that they all seem to lack some sort of anti-aliasing. Decreased texture quality due to lower resolutions doesn't really bother me all that much, but man, these jagged edges. All of this combined didn't really make CSGO comfortable at all to play on consoles. CSX felt pretty good because there were a number of small changes made to have it better suited to being on the console platform, whereas CSGO pretty much tried to shoehorn the PC version into the console generation that was pretty much only a year away from being replaced. At the end of the day, there are at least two benefits to the console versions over the final PC version. The first being the support for online matchmaking, which is still available on both the Xbox and PS3 surprisingly. Although in my case, I couldn't find a match at all on the PS3, so I guess I'll just settle for the bots. The second benefit here being the old gun sounds still present in these versions, instead of the updated sounds added to the PC version in 2017. The memories. Much like Counter-Strike's Xbox edition, the main drawback, other than the plethora I've already listed, is the lack of community servers and modding, for the same reasons as I mentioned there before. Matchmaking and ranks were especially big for CSGO, but there truly is no replacement for the broader community aspect that these independently hosted servers brought to the table. In the end, CSGO's console versions weren't exactly smash hits, and the official reason as to why Valve never continued support for them still remains somewhat of a mystery. It does make some sense as to why they decided to release these versions in the first place. After all, the origins of CSGO itself lie within an idea for a console-focused CS game. But with the PS4 and Xbox One to be released the next year, 2012 was pretty much the winding down period for the 7th generation consoles. Even with its decent critical reception and sales, its small player base relative to the PC was more than likely the reason why the console versions never got so much as a single update. I guess if you still wanted your CSGO matchmaking fix, you could always fire up your old PS3, grab your mouse and keyboard for some good old 2012 CSGO fun in all its glory. But I'll be honest, I'm mainly just here for those classic weapon sounds.